So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Mandela effect. It's this weird thing where people remember something one way, but somehow history shows it differently. Like a whole group of people will swear they remember something that apparently never happened. It's named after Nelson Mandela because a ton of people remember him dying in prison in the 80s, even though he actually died in 2013. People remember entire events that somehow just don't exist. Sounds strange, right? Anyway, I didn't really think much about the mental effect stuff before. I thought it was just people's memories playing tricks on them. But then something happened to me, and now I can't stop thinking about it. Every day since, I feel like I'm living in a reality that isn't quite right, like it's slightly out of sync with the one I remember. So this all started back in 2012. I woke up one day just like any other morning and went about my usual routine. Everything seemed normal at first. Shower, coffee, check my phone, scroll through social media. I didn't notice anything off right away. But the more the day went on, the more I started to feel this unsettling sense that things were different, like it was all just a little bit off. The first thing I noticed was my toothbrush. I know that sounds weird, but I always use the same one, blue with white stripes. That morning though, it was green with white stripes. I brushed it off, no pun intended, as me just being tired or something. Maybe I bought a new toothbrush and forgot. It seemed silly, so I just ignored it. But then I went into the kitchen to make my usual breakfast. 2 eggs scrambled, toast and black coffee. I'd made the same breakfast every morning for years, but when I opened the fridge, I couldn't find the eggs. Instead, there was a carton of orange juice in the spot where I always keep the eggs. Again, I told myself I must have moved them or bought orange juice instead of eggs without remembering. But it felt weird, you know. Like these little details weren't lining up, and they were things I usually didn't even have to think about. Then, on my way to work, things got even stranger. I took the same route I'd driven a million times, but that morning I noticed a building I'd never seen before. A bright yellow building with a sign that read, Fred's Deli. I swear I'd never seen it in my life, and I drive by that spot every single day. I asked the coworker about it when I got to work, and he just gave me a weird look and said, Fred's Deli? That place has been there for years, man. I laughed it off, trying to play it cool, but I was starting to get this uneasy feeling in my stomach. Work was normal for the most part, but I kept noticing small things. My boss was wearing glasses. Now, I'd worked with him for 2 years, and I'd never seen him wear glasses before. When I asked him about it, he looked at me like I was crazy, and said he'd been wearing them for years. I tried to laugh it off again, but I was starting to feel like maybe I was losing it. The rest of the day was filled with those little moments. Small details that didn't seem right, but were too subtle to prove or explain. The logo on the coffee machine looked different, my coworker was wearing a watch on his right wrist when he usually wore it on his left, and the office clock seemed like it was ticking slower than normal. These are tiny, dumb things, but they all added up, making me feel like I was living a different version of my life. When I got home that night, I decided to call my mom. She answered on the first ring, and her voice was different, just slightly deeper than I remembered. I'd tried not to let it get to me, and asked her about our family dog, Max, who I thought was getting pretty old. But she told me that Max had passed away 3 years ago. That just didn't make sense. I remembered playing with Max just the month before. I actually felt tears well up because, in my mind, he was still around. It felt real, that memory. How could he have been gone for 3 years? I hung up, totally shaken, and decided to sleep it off, hoping I'd wake up in the morning and everything would feel normal again. But over the next few days, things just got worse. I started noticing more and more things that didn't match up with how I remembered them. My favorite cereal brand was different, like the logo had slightly changed and even the taste seemed off. I swear my neighbor across the street had a blue car, but suddenly it was red. When I mentioned it to him, he looked at me like I was nuts and said it had always been red. I started doing some research, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe I was having memory issues, or maybe stress was playing tricks on my mind. But the more I looked, the more I came across these Mandela effect stories. People remembering things one way, only to find out the world insisted they were wrong. That's when I started thinking that maybe this wasn't all in my head. Maybe somehow I had shifted into an alternate version of my life, like I'd crossed some invisible line without even realizing it. I started obsessing over it. I began making a list of every single thing that felt off, every detail, every slight difference. I kept notebooks filled with them, pages and pages of these little inconsistencies that no one else seemed to notice. My friends started noticing it too, but in a bad way. I stopped hanging out as much, started spending all my time researching and looking for more proof that I was in some kind of alternate universe. I stopped talking to my family because every time I did, I noticed something else that wasn't right. My sister's favorite color was suddenly green instead of blue. My dad's job title had changed, even though he'd been at the same job for 20 years. These weren't huge things, but they were big enough to make me feel like I didn't know the people closest to me. Finally, one night I went down a rabbit hole on some forum where people shared their own Mandela effect experiences. Reading these stories, I found people who remembered the same things I did, like Fred's Deli or the cereal's brand logo. These people had experienced them too, but they all lived in different cities and countries, with no way of us all sharing the same memory mistakes. That was when it hit me. Maybe I really had slipped into another version of my life, a version just barely different from my own. But I also realized there was no way to prove it. No one else would ever understand, and I didn't even fully understand it myself. I started distancing myself from everyone after that. I felt like an alien in my own life. People would talk to me, but it felt like they were talking to some version of me that I couldn't even relate to anymore. To this day, I still don't know what happened, or if any of it was real. I still see little things here and there that make me think I'm not quite in the right version of reality. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever go back to the world I remember. Or maybe this is just how life is now, like I will keep drifting further from the reality I once knew. I don't know if I believe in blessings, or if that's even the right word for what I'm about to tell you. But after my accident, I found myself in a version of my life I never thought possible. Every day I'm torn between feeling grateful and feeling like I'm losing my mind. I don't really know what to make of it, and I know some people won't believe me, but here goes nothing. It started with a car accident about 6 months ago. I was coming back from a late night at work, exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. It was one of those long shifts that drag on forever. I'd stayed longer than usual, so the streets were almost empty. I remember looking down at my phone for a split second, just long enough for my car to drift out of my lane. The next thing I knew, I was skidding across the road and everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed, the bright lights burning my eyes as I opened them. The doctors told me I'd been out for a few days and had suffered a mild concussion along with a broken leg. I was lucky, they said, to have survived with injuries as minor as those. Honestly, I didn't feel lucky. I was in pain, exhausted and kind of numb mentally. But it was nothing compared to the shock that was coming. When I got discharged and got home, things felt different. The house itself was the same, but there was this weird feeling I couldn't shake. It was just way off. But I was still groggy from the meds, so I chalked it up to that. My wife Sarah had already prepped the place to make sure I'd be comfortable while recovering, setting up a small area in the living room so I wouldn't have to go up and down the stairs too much. I remember being so grateful for her, thinking how lucky I was to have her support. The first big shock came later that night when I was lying in bed. Out of nowhere, I heard a soft giggle, childlike and sweet, coming from down the hall. I figured it was just my meds messing with my head. But then the door opened, and in came a little girl, her tiny feet shuffling on the carpet as she came over to the side of my bed. "Daddy, you're awake," she said, smile up at me. Now here's where things get hard to explain. I don't have a daughter. At least I didn't before the accident. My wife and I had a son. His name was Ethan, and he passed away last year. Losing him was the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. That grief had been so deep, so overwhelming that I felt like I'd never escape it. So, seeing this little girl in front of me calling me daddy, I honestly thought I was losing it. I sat up and just stared at her, my heart pounding. Her name, I found out, was Emily. She looked like she was around 5 years old, with Sarah's big brown eyes and dark hair that framed her face just like my wife's. I sat there in complete shock, my mind racing. I thought maybe I was dreaming, or that the meds were giving me some sort of hallucination. But she was there, real and solid as she could be. "Are you okay, Daddy?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I didn't know what to say. Sarah walked in a moment later, and it was like she'd known all along. She didn't look surprised. She just looked normal, as if nothing unusual was happening. I was sitting there trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing, and Sarah just smiled and kissed my forehead. "Emily wanted to say goodnight. She was so worried about you while you were in the hospital," Sarah said. I tried to stay calm, but I was reeling. My brain kept screaming that none of this made sense. But there was no one else to talk to about it, no one I could ask. How could I even begin to explain it? I just played along, feeling completely out of place in my own life. Emily hugged me, said goodnight, and walked down the hall humming a little tune that sounded so familiar and comforting, yet so wrong. Over the next few days, I kept waiting for some kind of explanation, some sign that I was dreaming or that I'd lost my mind. But nothing happened. Emily was there every morning, coming to say hi and talk about her plans for the day. She had drawings she wanted to show me, stories she wanted to tell me, and I went along with it because I didn't know what else to do. I was stuck between the life I remembered, a life where my son had passed away, and this new reality where I was the father of a little girl who seemed to know me just as well as I knew her. My wife acted like everything was normal. She talked about Emily like she'd always been there. I asked Sarah questions, trying to keep it subtle at first, but I'd bring up Ethan sometimes, see if she'd correct me or react in some way. But every time I mentioned him, she looked sad, confused, like I just reminded her of something painful that didn't quite fit. One night, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I asked her straight out, "Do you remember? Do you remember Ethan?" She looked at me with tears in her eyes and nodded slowly. She said, "Of course I do. But honey, we need to focus on Emily now. She's our blessing, the joy we needed after losing Ethan." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Sarah remembered him too, but she seemed at peace in a way I couldn't understand. Like somehow in her mind, this was the natural course of things. And maybe she was right. Maybe this new life was our chance to move on, to heal, to let go of the crushing grief we'd been carrying. But that didn't make it any easier for me to accept. I felt like I was caught between two versions of my life, like I'd been given this second chance, but had no clue how to live it. Every day since I've spent with Emily, trying to be the dad she thinks I am. She's sweet, bright, and so much like Sarah it hurts sometimes. I don't know where she came from, how she became a part of our lives, or if any of it is real. But what I do know is that she's here now, and I love her with the same fierce love I had for Ethan. In some strange way, she fills the same space in my heart that Ethan once did. I still think about Ethan, and there's a part of me that feels guilty, like I'd been betraying his memory by accepting Emily into our lives. But then I see her smile, hear her laugh, and for a moment it feels like everything might actually be okay. Maybe this is life's way of giving us a second chance, a way to keep going even after losing everything. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened, but I'm learning to live with it. Maybe that's the real blessing, the chance to live in the now, even if I don't understand how it came to be. The accident took something from me, yes, but it also gave me something back. I don't know if I'm in the same world I was before, but this new life, this one with Emily, it's a new life I'm slowly coming to love. And that's something I can hold on to, no matter how strange it all seems.